My wife threw me divorce papers on Christmas. Then her parents clapped finally. But when she opened my gift, her smirk vanished BC inside. I watched Amelia slide divorce papers across the Christmas dinner table, her parents cheering, a smug smile plastered on her face. She thought she'd won. She had no idea the gift I was about to give her would shatter everything. The air in Robert and Martha's dining room, usually buzzing with holiday cheer, was thick with their triumphant claps, a crushing silence for me. Martha, her mother, actually said, finally, with a wide grin, while Robert, her dad, patted Amelia's shoulder like she'd just closed the deal of the century. Amelia's smirk, that satisfied little grin, told me she'd been planning this for months, waiting for the perfect moment to humiliate me. But then, I slid my own small, carefully wrapped gift across the table. "Open this," I told her, "before you get too excited about your performance." She rolled her eyes, still smirking, still radiating confidence, and tore off the wrapping paper with dramatic flourishes. The moment she opened that box, her face went from smug satisfaction to absolute horror in about 2 seconds flat. The color drained from her cheeks. Her hands started shaking. And suddenly, nobody was clapping anymore. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This nightmare actually began 8 months earlier, when I first felt that cold knot of dread in my stomach. We'd been married 7 years, together for 9 total, and I genuinely thought we were solid. We met back in college at some terrible house party. She was the only one in the corner, actually reading a book, not doing keg stands, and I was immediately hooked. She was getting her MBA, I was building my construction consulting business from nothing, working 18-hour days, often sleeping in my truck between job sites. Her family never approved of me, never really did, because I didn't come from money and I worked with my hands. But back then, she always defended me. Always told them I'd be successful, that I was ambitious and hardworking, everything they should want for their daughter. Robert, her dad, owned some finance company downtown and treated me like I was the help every time I came over for dinner. I dealt with it because I loved her, and I believed she had my back. Things were pretty great for the first 6 years. My business took off around year 3. We bought a nice apartment in a good neighborhood in Seattle, took vacations to places even her parents had to admit were impressive. I thought we were truly building something together. Then, about 8 months before that Christmas dinner, little things started shifting, subtle changes that made my stomach clench, but I couldn't quite pinpoint why. First, her phone. It had never had a password in all our years together. Suddenly, it was locked down with a 6-digit code she wouldn't tell me. When I asked, she got defensive, instantly, saying I was paranoid and controlling. That she deserved privacy, that married people didn't have to share absolutely everything. I backed off, because I didn't want to be that husband, the suspicious, jealous type who checks phones like a prison warden. But it bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Then came the girls' nights. For years, she'd gone out with friends once or twice a month, and I never thought anything of it. But suddenly, it was every single Friday and Saturday night. Sometimes, she wouldn't come home until 3 or 4 in the morning. She'd say she was staying at her friend Chloe's place because she'd had too much to drink and didn't want to drive. Seemed responsible enough. But when she finally came home, I'd smell her hair. No alcohol. No bar smoke. Nothing but expensive hotel soap and shampoo that definitely wasn't from Chloe's apartment. When I pointed this out, she got angry. Called me ridiculous, said I was inventing problems. Then she'd flip it around, her voice taking on this hurt tone, "You trust me, don't you?" It made me feel like a bad husband for even questioning her. The financial stuff started showing up on our joint credit card around the same time. Hotels downtown. Nice ones, too, the kind that run $200 a night minimum. Fancy restaurants I'd never been to with her. Expensive wine bars. Room service charges at 11 at night. When I asked her about these, she had explanations ready immediately, almost like she'd practiced them. The hotels were for work conferences she'd forgotten to mention. The restaurants were client dinners her company would reimburse. The wine bars were where the girls' nights happened because Chloe supposedly loved that particular place. Every single explanation was technically possible, technically reasonable, but all of them together started feeling like a wall of lies, stacked so high I couldn't see over it anymore. Our relationship at home deteriorated fast around month 5 of this weirdness. We went from having conversations every night to barely speaking, except to coordinate schedules or argue about the trash. Intimacy completely disappeared. When I tried to talk about it, she'd say she was stressed from work, tired from her social life, exhausted from dealing with my constant suspicion and negativity. Everything became my fault somehow. Every problem was because I wasn't supportive enough, wasn't giving her space, wasn't trusting her like a good husband should. The gaslighting got so intense I started questioning my own sanity, wondering if I really was just paranoid and inventing drama. But then I noticed something that made all the pieces click together in the worst possible way. Her sister Brooke's husband, Liam, started acting really weird around me at family gatherings. Avoiding eye contact. Leaving rooms when I entered. Liam worked in corporate real estate and had always been friendly with me before, asking about my business, treating me like a human being, unlike the rest of her family. Now, he could barely look at me. When he did, there was this guilty expression on his face that made my blood run cold. I started thinking about timelines and realized Amelia's weird behavior had started right around the time Liam and Brooke had moved back to Seattle after living in Chicago for 3 years. I didn't want to believe what I was thinking. It was too horrible, too cliché, too much like something from a bad TV movie. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop adding up all the little details that suddenly made terrible sense when viewed through this new, dark lens. So, I did something I'd never done in 7 years of marriage. I called my buddy Owen, who runs a private investigation company. I asked him to follow Amelia for a weekend, just to see where she really went during these suspiciously regular girls' nights. Owen owed me a favor from when I'd helped him renovate his office for basically cost, so he agreed to do it quietly, without too many questions. That first weekend of surveillance changed everything. Owen sent me photos Sunday morning that made me feel like someone had punched a hole through my chest and ripped my heart out with their bare hands. Amelia's car was parked at a Hilton downtown Friday night and didn't leave until Saturday afternoon. Liam's car was parked 3 spots away. Owen had photos of them entering the hotel together at 9 p.m., holding hands and laughing like they were on a honeymoon. He had photos of them leaving together the next morning, her wearing the same clothes from the night before, him with his arm around her waist. There were more photos from Saturday night showing them at an expensive Italian restaurant I'd always wanted to take her to, but she'd said was too pricey. And then more photos of them going back to the same hotel for round 2. I sat in my truck in the Lowe's parking lot, staring at those photos for probably an hour, feeling like my entire life had just been revealed as a lie. This wasn't a one-time mistake or a drunken hookup. This was systematic, planned, ongoing. This was my wife of 7 years having a full-blown affair with her own sister's husband, betraying not just me, but her entire family in the most devastating way possible. And based on how comfortable they looked together, how natural and easy their body language seemed, this had been going on for months at minimum. I told Owen to keep following them. I needed to know exactly how deep this went. Over the next month, the evidence piled up like a prosecutor's dream case. Every single weekend, without fail, same pattern, same hotels, same routine. But then, Owen found something even worse while digging into Liam's finances for me. Turns out, Liam had been using his corporate credit card to pay for a lot of these hotels and dinners, essentially embezzling from his company to fund his affair with my wife. We're talking $12,000 over 8 months. All documented, all traceable, all completely illegal. This idiot had created a paper trail of his own crimes while destroying 2 marriages simultaneously. The final piece fell into place when Owen managed to access Amelia's Gmail account through some technical method he wouldn't explain. Those emails were like reading a script for the worst movie ever made. Full of intimate details I never wanted to know, and future plans that made me physically sick. They'd been talking about leaving their spouses for months, making detailed plans about how to start their new life together, discussing when would be the best time to drop the bomb on everyone. And then I found the email that made me realize this Christmas dinner ambush was fully premeditated. They decided the perfect moment to announce everything would be at the family Christmas gathering, where they could tell everyone at once and present themselves as this brave couple who'd found true love despite the messy circumstances. Amelia wanted to serve me divorce papers in front of her family so they could all witness my humiliation and support her decision. Make me look like the bad guy who somehow deserved this treatment. She wanted her moment of triumph, her big dramatic scene where she got to be the hero of her own story while I played the discarded loser husband who wasn't good enough for their family. What she didn't know was that I'd spent the last month preparing my own surprise, working with lawyers, accountants, and investigators to build a case so airtight that nobody could wiggle out of the consequences. I transferred our apartment into a trust with some very careful legal work. Moved assets around in ways that were completely legitimate, but that protected everything I'd built. I'd created separate folders of evidence for every person who needed to see it, including her sister, her parents, Liam's boss, and eventually, the police. I'd even moved her belongings to a storage unit the week before Christmas, and had a locksmith scheduled to change the locks that morning while we were at her parents' house. I was going to let her have her Christmas dinner ambush, let her feel like she'd won for exactly as long as it took her to open my gift. So that's how I ended up sitting at that table, watching her face transform from smug victory to absolute terror, knowing that everything she planned was about to explode in the worst possible way. The box I gave Amelia contained something simple but devastating. A USB drive and a small stack of printed photos showing her and Liam in various hotels over the past 2 months, along with a note that just said, "Open the drive on your laptop. Everyone deserves to see what you've been doing." She tried to shove everything back in the box quickly, but her hands were shaking too badly, and some of the photos spilled onto the table where Brooke, her sister, could see them. Brooke picked up one of the photos, showing Liam and Amelia kissing outside an Omni Hotel entrance. The sound that came out of Brooke's mouth was something between a scream and a gasp that made everyone at the table freeze instantly. Robert and Martha looked confused at first. Then Robert grabbed the USB drive from the box and said, "What the hell is this?" in that commanding voice he usually reserved for firing employees at his finance company. I stood up slowly and told everyone that before we discussed divorce, maybe they should all know exactly why their daughter wanted to end our marriage so badly. Amelia started saying, "Don't you dare," but her voice cracked halfway through, and suddenly she didn't sound confident anymore, just desperate and scared. I explained very calmly that for the past 8 months, she'd been having an affair with Liam. That they'd been using our joint credit card to fund their hotel weekends, and that Liam had also been embezzling from his company to pay for additional expenses our card couldn't cover. Brooke stood up so fast her chair fell backward, and she started screaming at Liam, asking if this was true, calling him every name I'd been thinking for the past month, but had been too numb to say out loud. Liam tried to deny it at first, but his face was bright red, and he couldn't make eye contact with anyone. Just kept stammering about how it wasn't what it looked like and how he could explain everything. Martha grabbed the USB drive from Robert and said she wanted to see proof because this was too insane to believe without evidence. I told her to go ahead and plug it into any computer she wanted. That everything was organized into folders labeled by date and location, complete with hotel receipts, credit card statements, and email exchanges between Amelia and Liam planning their entire future together. Robert actually did plug it into his laptop right there at the table. I watched his face change as he scrolled through folders containing months of documented evidence that his daughter had been systematically destroying 2 marriages while stealing money to fund her affair. He kept saying, "Jesus Christ," over and over under his breath, getting quieter each time, like he was running out of air. The emails were probably the worst part for everyone to read, because they weren't just about logistics and meeting times. They were full of intimate details and future plans that made it clear this wasn't some casual fling. Amelia and Liam had been discussing leaving their spouses since month 3 of their affair, talking about getting an apartment downtown, planning trips to Europe they wanted to take once they were free, even joking about how relieved they'd be to escape their boring marriages. There was one email where Amelia called me a project that never quite worked out and said she'd only stayed with me as long as she did because I'd finally started making decent money and her parents had stopped pressuring her to leave. Reading that email had felt like being stabbed when Owen first showed it to me. But watching her parents read it now, sitting 3 feet away from her, felt like vindication. Her mother started crying, asking how she could do this to her sister, to her family, to herself. Amelia just sat there with her head in her hands, not answering anything. Liam tried to leave at one point, but Brooke blocked the door and told him if he walked out, she'd call the police herself and report the embezzlement, which was technically my plan anyway, but I appreciated her initiative. Robert closed his laptop and asked me how long I'd known. I told him about the month of investigation, the private detective, the financial audits, all of it. He looked at me with something I'd never seen from him before, something that might have been respect, and said he was sorry that his daughter had put me through this nightmare. But I wasn't done yet, because the divorce papers she'd served me were only one part of her plan, and I wanted everyone to understand the full scope of what she'd been attempting to do. I pulled out my own folder from my jacket and explained that over the past month I'd been working with lawyers to protect everything I'd built. That our apartment was now in a trust she couldn't touch. That our joint accounts had been legally separated with her signature on documents she'd signed without reading carefully. That my business was now under an LLC structure that excluded her completely. Every single asset I'd worked for was protected. And the best part was that she'd helped me do it by signing papers I told her were routine business documents that needed spousal signatures. Her face went even paler when I explained this. Robert actually laughed, this short, bitter laugh, and said, "He outplayed you completely." Then I told them about Liam's embezzlement. Showed them the evidence Owen had compiled, showing $12,000 in corporate funds used for personal expenses over 8 months, all documented with receipts and credit card statements. I explained that I'd already sent this information to Liam's boss and to the company's legal department, and that there would likely be criminal charges filed within the next week. Liam started crying at this point, actual tears running down his face, saying he'd pay it all back and begging me not to destroy his life over a mistake. I looked at him and said, "You destroyed your own life the first time you took my wife to a hotel on your company's dime." Brooke announced right there that she was filing for divorce and taking their daughter to stay with her parents until she found her own place. And Martha, my mother-in-law, immediately said that wouldn't be possible because they weren't supporting this mess. The whole family dynamic I'd watched for 9 years just shattered in about 15 minutes. Everyone turning on each other, blame flying in every direction. Amelia sobbing and trying to explain that they'd fallen in love and couldn't help themselves. Robert shut that down immediately and said, "You could have helped yourself by getting divorced before you started sleeping with your sister's husband," in this cold voice I'd never heard him use with his daughters before. I grabbed my coat and told everyone I was leaving, that my lawyer would be in touch with Amelia about the divorce proceedings, and that I'd be filing a countersuit for adultery and financial damages that would make her initial paperwork look like a joke. Amelia tried to stop me as I walked toward the door, grabbing my arm, saying we needed to talk privately, that I didn't understand the whole situation. I pulled my arm away and told her, "I understand that you wanted to humiliate me in front of your family today, but instead you humiliated yourself in front of everyone who matters. And that's something you're going to have to live with forever." Her mom was still crying. Her dad was yelling at Liam about betraying their family's trust. Brooke was on the phone, presumably calling a divorce lawyer. And Amelia just stood there in the middle of all this chaos she'd created, looking small and lost. I walked up to my truck and sat there for a minute, watching through the window as the family continued imploding without me. My phone started buzzing with texts from Amelia, begging me to come back inside and talk, saying she'd made a mistake, saying we could work through this. I blocked her number right there and drove to my apartment. Except it wasn't our apartment anymore. It was legally mine in every way that mattered. When she eventually tried to come home later that night, all her keys didn't work, and all her belongings were waiting for her in a climate-controlled storage unit I'd paid for through the end of the month. The thing about revenge is that it only feels good if you've really thought it through. If you've covered every angle and protected yourself from the fallout. I'd spent a month preparing for this exact moment. Working with 3 different lawyers to make sure everything I did was completely legal. Transferring assets in ways that couldn't be challenged in court. Building evidence files that would hold up under any scrutiny. Amelia had spent 8 months thinking she was so clever, planning her big Christmas announcement, probably fantasizing about how free she'd feel once she finally escaped our marriage. What she didn't understand was that I'd been 3 steps ahead of her the entire time. And now she was standing in the wreckage of her own life with nobody left to blame but herself. The best part was knowing that this was just the beginning, that the legal proceedings, and criminal charges, and social fallout were all still coming, and that every single consequence was something she'd earned through her own choices. The divorce proceedings started in early January, about 2 weeks after Christmas, and turned into exactly the nightmare Amelia had been trying to avoid by ambushing me first. My lawyer filed a countersuit citing adultery with documented evidence, financial infidelity, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, which apparently is a real legal thing you can sue for in our state. Her lawyer tried to argue for a standard 50-50 split of assets, but my attorney just kept stacking evidence folders on the table during mediation until her side basically gave up trying to claim she deserved anything. The judge took one look at the timeline of her affair, the financial records showing how she'd spent her money on hotels with another man, and the emails discussing how to manipulate the divorce announcement for maximum impact, and decided that equitable distribution wasn't going to apply in this case. The divorce was finalized 6 months later, in July. I kept the apartment, the car, my business, and our joint savings, while she walked away with her personal belongings and about $15,000 in credit card debt she'd racked up during those 8 months of affair expenses. Liam's situation got even worse somehow, which I didn't think was possible, but corporate America doesn't mess around with embezzlement. His company fired him 3 days after I sent them the evidence, then immediately filed criminal charges for theft of corporate funds and fraud. The investigation expanded once the company's forensic accountants got involved, and they found he'd actually stolen closer to $18,000, not the $12,000 documented. He tried to pay it all back immediately by liquidating his retirement accounts and taking loans from family members, but the company prosecuted anyway because they wanted to make an example out of him. He ended up pleading guilty to avoid trial and got sentenced to 14 months in county jail, plus 5 years probation and full restitution including interest and the company's legal fees. Brooke divorced him while he was awaiting sentencing and got primary custody of their daughter plus child support that would start the moment he got out of jail, assuming he could find any job willing to hire a convicted embezzler. Amelia's life fell apart in stages that were almost poetic to watch from a distance. First, she lost her job at the marketing firm where she'd worked for 6 years. Not because they fired her officially, but because the scandal made her radioactive, and they encouraged her to resign before clients started requesting different account managers. Then she lost her friend group, because apparently nobody wants to stay close with someone who had an affair with her own brother-in-law and blew up 2 families simultaneously. Her social media went from constant posts about brunches and girls' trips to completely silent because every photo she'd posted for the past year was basically evidence of lies she'd been telling. She moved back into her childhood bedroom at her parents' house because she couldn't afford rent anywhere decent on unemployment benefits. And Robert and Martha made it clear she wasn't welcome to stay long-term. The financial destruction was probably the most satisfying part for me because money was always how her family measured success and worth. She'd spent years looking down on my working-class background while enjoying the lifestyle my business provided. And now she was broken away her family found absolutely shameful. Her parents had to take out a loan to pay for her divorce attorney because she'd burned through her savings on affair expenses and had nothing left for legal defense. They made her pay them back by working at Robert's company doing data entry for $13 an hour, which was apparently the only job he could give her without his other employees quitting in protest. Her sister, Brooke, wouldn't speak to her at all, wouldn't let her see her niece, blocked her on every platform, and told everyone at their mom's book club exactly what had happened. So, the whole social circle knew the details. My business actually grew during this period because apparently people love supporting a small business owner who got publicly betrayed and handled it with class. The story got around through my network of contractors and clients, always framed as, this guy's wife cheated on him with her sister's husband, and he completely outmaneuvered her legally. I got referrals from people who'd never used my services before, but who wanted to support me. Got invited to networking events by guys who respected how I'd handled the situation. Even got featured in a local business magazine article about entrepreneurs who'd overcome personal adversity. Everything she tried to take from me ended up making me stronger, while everything she tried to build for herself crumbled into nothing. About 4 months after the divorce was finalized, in November, I ran into her at Lowe's while I was picking up materials for a renovation project. She looked terrible. Beyond not wearing makeup or having her hair done. She looked defeated and exhausted, like someone who'd been running on fumes for months. She tried to approach me in the parking lot, and I immediately told her we had nothing to discuss, that our lawyers could communicate if there were any legal issues remaining. She started crying right there between the cars and said she'd made the biggest mistake of her life, that she'd thrown away something real for something that was never going to work, that she understood now what she'd lost. I just looked at her and said, "You didn't lose anything. You deliberately destroyed it because you thought you'd found something better. And now you get to live with that choice forever." She asked if there was any chance we could talk, maybe get coffee, maybe work toward forgiveness, even if we couldn't work toward reconciliation. I told her I'd forgiven her months ago because holding on to anger was just hurting myself, but that forgiveness didn't mean I wanted her in my life in any capacity. She kept saying she'd changed, that she'd learned from this experience, that she was going to therapy and working on herself. I believed her, probably, but I also didn't care because her personal growth journey wasn't my responsibility anymore. I told her, "I spent 7 years loving someone who turned out to be a character you were playing, and I'm not interested in meeting whoever you actually are underneath that performance." Then I got in my truck and drove away while she stood there crying in the parking lot. The last I heard through mutual acquaintances was that she'd moved to a different city about an hour and a half away to escape the social fallout and start over somewhere nobody knew her story. She got a job doing customer service for an insurance company, making about $40,000 a year, which was half what she'd been making before and a quarter of what our combined household income had been. She was dating someone new, apparently, some guy she'd met through a dating app who didn't know about her past. And I genuinely hoped it worked out for her because I wasn't the kind of person who wanted her to suffer forever. I just wanted her to suffer enough to understand what she'd done, to really feel the consequences of betraying everyone who trusted her. Liam got out of jail after 11 months on good behavior and moved in with his parents because Brooke had sold their house and taken her half of the proceeds. He was working at a warehouse doing inventory management for $15 an hour because his felony conviction made it impossible to get hired in corporate real estate again. He was paying child support and restitution and still owed his parents money for the initial payback to his company, so basically his entire paycheck disappeared before he saw any of it. Brooke had remarried about 18 months after their divorce to a guy from her gym who apparently treated her daughter like his own and actually showed up for family events. And I was genuinely happy for her because she'd been an innocent victim in all this, just like me. Amelia's parents never apologized to me directly, but Robert did send me a formal letter about 6 months after everything imploded, saying he'd misjudged my character and that I'd handled an impossible situation with more grace and intelligence than he'd given me credit for. He didn't ask for forgiveness or try to maintain a relationship, just acknowledged that he'd been wrong about me and that his daughter had destroyed something valuable through her own selfishness. I appreciated the letter even though it didn't change anything. Because having that validation from someone who'd looked down on me for years felt like closing a circle. The whole experience taught me that revenge doesn't have to be loud or dramatic to be effective. It just has to be thorough, and legal, and perfectly timed. Amelia had wanted her big dramatic moment at Christmas dinner where she got to be the hero of her own story. And I'd let her have exactly that moment, right up until I turned it into her worst nightmare. She wanted to humiliate me in front of her family. Instead, she'd humiliated herself so completely that years later, people still talked about it as a cautionary tale. She'd wanted to start fresh with Liam, and instead she'd ended up alone and broke and socially destroyed while he sat in jail paying for both their mistakes. I moved on, eventually started dating again, met someone who actually appreciated what I'd built and who didn't see my background as something to overcome. My business kept growing. My apartment appreciated in value. My life got better in ways I couldn't have imagined while I was sitting in that Lowe's parking lot looking at evidence photos and feeling like my world had ended. Sometimes I still thought about that Christmas dinner and how perfectly everything had gone according to my plan. How her face had looked when she opened that box and realized she'd been outmaneuvered completely. Those thoughts didn't make me angry anymore. They just made me grateful that I'd had the sense to protect myself and the patience to let her destroy herself. She wanted to end our marriage on her terms, but in the end, she'd ended it on mine, and that made all the difference. What do you think about how all this played out?